A Friend in Need, a short story by Somerset Maugham. For 30 years now, I have been studying my fellow men. I do not know very much about them. I should certainly hesitate to engage a servant on his face, and yet I suppose it is on the face that for the most part we judge the persons we meet. We draw our conclusions from the shape of the jaw, the look in the eyes, the contour of the mouth. I wonder if we are more often right than wrong. Why novels and plays are so often untrue to life is because their authors, perhaps of necessity, make their characters all of a piece. They cannot afford to make them self-contradictory, for then they become incomprehensible, and yet self-contradictory is what most of us are. We are a haphazard bundle of inconsistent qualities. In books on logic, they will tell you that it is absurd to say that yellow is tubular or gratitude heavier than air, but in that mixture of incongruities that makes up the self-yellow may very well be a horse and cart, and gratitude the middle of next week. I shrug my shoulders when people tell me that their first impressions of a person are always right. I think they must have small insight or great vanity. For my own part, I find that the longer I know people, the more they puzzle me. My oldest friends are just those of whom I can say that I don't know the first thing about them. These reflections have occurred to me because I read in this morning's paper that Edward Hyde Burton had died at Kobe. He was a merchant, and he had been in business in Japan for many years. I knew him very little, but he interested me because once he gave me a great surprise. Unless I had heard the story from his own lips, I should never have believed that he was capable of such an action. It was more startling because both in appearance and manner, he suggested a very definite type. Here, if ever, was a man all of a piece. He was a tiny little fellow, not much more than 5'4" in height, and very slender, with white hair, a red face much wrinkled, and blue eyes. I suppose he was about 60 when I knew him. He was always neatly and quietly dressed in accordance with his age and station. Though his offices were in Kobe, Burton often came down to Yokohama. I happened on one occasion to be spending a few days there, waiting for a ship, and I was introduced to him at the British Club. We played bridge together. He played a good game and a generous one. He did not talk very much either then or later when we were having drinks, but what he said was sensible. He had a quiet, dry humor. He seemed to be popular at the club, and afterwards, when he had gone, they described him as one of the best. It happened that we were both staying at the Grand Hotel, and next day he asked me to dine with him. I met his wife, fat, elderly and smiling, and his 2 daughters. It was evidently a united and affectionate family. I think the chief thing that struck me about Burton was his kindliness. There was something very pleasing in his mild blue eyes. His voice was gentle. You could not imagine that he could possibly raise it in anger. His smile was benign. Here was a man who attracted you because you felt in him a real love for his fellows. He had charm, but there was nothing mawkish in him. He liked his game of cards and his cocktail. He could tell with point a good and spicy story, and in his youth he had been something of an athlete. He was a rich man, and he had made every penny himself. I suppose one thing that made you like him was that he was so small and frail. He aroused your instincts of protection. You felt that he could not bear to hurt a fly. One afternoon I was sitting in the lounge of the Grand Hotel. This was before the earthquake, and they had leather armchairs there. From the windows, you had a spacious view of the harbor with its crowded traffic. There were great liners on their way to Vancouver and San Francisco, or to Europe by way of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore. There were tramps of all nations, battered and sea-worn, junks with their high sterns and great colored sails, and innumerable sampans. It was a busy, exhilarating scene, and yet I know not why, restful to the spirit. Here was romance, and it seemed that you had but to stretch out your hand to touch it. Burton came into the lounge presently and caught sight of me. He seated himself in the chair next to mine. What do you say to a little drink?" He clapped his hands for a boy and ordered 2 gin fizzes. As the boy brought them, a man passed along the street outside and, seeing me, waved his hand. "Do you know Turner?" said Burton, as I nodded a greeting. "I've met him at the club. I'm told he's a remittance man." "Yes, I believe he is. We have a good many here." "He plays bridge well." "They generally do. There was a fellow here last year, oddly enough a namesake of mine, who was the best bridge player I ever met." "I suppose you never came across him in London." "Lenny Button, he called himself. I believe he'd belonged to some very good clubs." "No, I don't believe I remember the name." He was quite a remarkable player. He seemed to have an instinct about the cards. It was uncanny. I used to play with him a lot. He was in Kobe for some time. Burton sipped his gin fizz. "It's rather a funny story," he said. "He wasn't a bad chap. I liked him. He was always well-dressed and smart-looking. He was handsome in a way, with curly hair and pink and white cheeks. Women thought a lot of him. There was no harm in him, you know. He was only wild. Of course he drank too much. Those sort of fellows always do. A bit of money used to come in for him once a quarter, and he made a bit more by card playing. He won a good deal of mine, I know that." Button gave a kindly chuckle. I knew from my own experience that he could lose money at bridge with a good grace. He stroked his shaven chin with his thin hand. The veins stood out on it, and it was almost transparent. I suppose that is why he came to me when he went broke. That and the fact that he was a namesake of mine. He came to see me in my office one day and asked me for a job. I was rather surprised. He told me that there was no more money coming from home and he wanted to work. I asked him how old he was. 35, he said. "And what have you been doing hitherto?" I asked him. "Well, nothing very much," he said. I couldn't help laughing. "I'm afraid I can't do anything for you just yet," I said. "Come back and see me in another 35 years, and I'll see what I can do." He didn't move. He went rather pale. He hesitated for a moment, and then he told me that he had had bad luck at cards for some time. He hadn't been willing to stick to bridge. He'd been playing poker, and he'd got trimmed. He hadn't a penny. He'd pawned everything he had. He couldn't pay his hotel bill, and they wouldn't give him any more credit. He was down and out. If he couldn't get something to do, he'd have to commit suicide. I looked at him for a bit. I could see now that he was all to pieces. He'd been drinking more than usual, and he looked 50. The girls wouldn't have thought so much of him if they'd seen him then. "Well, isn't there anything you can do except play cards?" I asked him. "I can swim," he said. Swim. I could hardly believe my ears. It seemed such an insane answer to give. I swam for my university. I got some glimmering of what he was driving at. I've known too many men who were little tin gods at their university to be impressed by it. "I was a pretty good swimmer myself when I was a young man," I said. Suddenly I had an idea. Pausing in his story, Burton turned to me. "Do you know Kobe?" he asked. "No," I said. "I passed through it once, but I only spent a night there." "Then you don't know the Shioya Club? When I was a young man, I swam from there round the beacon and landed at the creek of Tarumi. It's over 3 miles, and it's rather difficult on account of the currents round the beacon. Well, I told my young namesake about it, and I said to him that if he'd do it, I'd give him a job." I could see he was rather taken aback. "You say you're a swimmer," I said. "I'm not in very good condition," he answered. I didn't say anything. I shrugged my shoulders. He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded. "All right," he said. "When do you want me to do it?" I looked at my watch. It was just after 10. "The swim shouldn't take you much over an hour and a quarter. I'll drive round to the creek at 12:30 and meet you. I'll take you back to the club to dress, and then we'll have lunch together." "Done," he said. We shook hands. I wished him good luck, and he left me. I had a lot of work to do that morning, and I only just managed to get to the creek at Tarumi at 12:30. But I needn't have hurried. He never turned up. Did he funk it at the last moment? I asked. No, he didn't funk it. He started all right, but of course he'd ruined his constitution by drink and dissipation. The currents round the beacon were more than he could manage. We didn't get the body for about 3 days. I didn't say anything for a moment or two. I was a trifle shocked. Then I asked Burton a question. When you made him that offer of a job, did you know he'd be drowned? He gave a little mild chuckle, and he looked at me with those kind and candid blue eyes of his. He rubbed his chin with his hand. Well, I hadn't got a vacancy in my office at the moment. In a Strange Land, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I am of a roving disposition, but I travel not to see imposing monuments, which indeed somewhat bore me, nor beautiful scenery, of which I soon tire. I travel to see men. I avoid the great. I would not cross the road to meet a president or a king. I am content to know the writer in the pages of his book and the painter in his picture. But I have journeyed 100 leagues to see a missionary of whom I had heard a strange story, and I have spent a fortnight in a vile hotel in order to improve my acquaintance with a billiard marker. I should be inclined to say that I am not surprised to meet any sort of person, were it not that there is one sort that I am constantly running against and that never fails to give me a little shock of amused astonishment. This is the elderly Englishwoman, generally of adequate means, who is to be found living alone up and down the world in unexpected places. You do not wonder when you hear of her living in a villa on a hill outside a small Italian town, the only Englishwoman in the neighborhood, and you are almost prepared for it when a lonely hacienda is pointed out to you in Andalusia, and you are told that there has dwelt for many years an English lady. But it is more surprising when you hear that the only white person in a Chinese city is an Englishwoman, not a missionary, who lives there none knows why. And there is another who inhabits an island in the South Seas, and a third who has a bungalow on the outskirts of a large village in the center of Java. They live solitary lives, these women without friends, and they do not welcome the stranger. Though they may not have seen one of their own race for months, they will pass you on the road as though they did not see you, and if, presuming on your nationality, you should call, as likely as not they will decline to see you. But if they do, they will give you a cup of tea from a silver teapot, and on a plate of old Worcester, you will find Scotch scones. They will talk to you politely, as though they were entertaining you in a Kentish vicarage, but when you take your leave, will show no particular desire to continue the acquaintance. One wonders in vain what strange instinct it is that has driven them to separate themselves from their kith and kin and thus to live apart from all their natural interests in an alien land. Is it romance they have sought or freedom? But of all these English women whom I have met, or perhaps only heard of, for as I have said they are difficult of access, the one who remains most vividly in my memory is an elderly person who lived in Asia Minor. I had arrived after a tedious journey at a little town from which I proposed to make the ascent of a celebrated mountain, and I was taken to a rambling hotel that stood at its foot. I arrived late at night and signed my name in the book. I went up to my room. It was cold, and I shivered as I undressed. But in a moment, there was a knock at the door, and the dragoman came in. "Signora Nicolini's compliments," he said. To my astonishment, he handed me a hot water bottle. I took it with grateful hands. "Who is Signora Nicolini?" I asked. "She is the proprietor of this hotel," he answered. I sent her my thanks, and he withdrew. The last thing I expected in a scrubby hotel in Asia Minor kept by an old Italian woman was a beautiful hot water bottle. There is nothing I like more. If we were not all sick to death of the war, I would tell you the story of how 6 men risked their lives to fetch a hot water bottle from a chateau in Flanders that was being bombarded. And next morning, so that I might thank her in person, I asked if I might see the Signora Nicolini. While I waited for her, I racked my brains to think what hot water bottle could possibly be in Italian. In a moment, she came in. She was a little stout woman, not without dignity, and she wore a black apron trimmed with lace and a small black lace cap. She stood with her hands crossed. I was astonished at her appearance, for she looked exactly like a housekeeper in a great English house. "Did you wish to speak to me, sir?" She was an Englishwoman, and in those few words I surely recognized the trace of a Cockney accent. "I wanted to thank you for the hot water bottle," I replied in some confusion. "I saw by the visitor's book that you were English, sir, and I always send up a hot water bottle to English gentlemen." Believe me, it was very welcome. "I was for many years in the service of the late Lord Ormskirk, sir. He always used to travel with a hot water bottle. Is there anything else, sir?" "Not at the moment, thank you." She gave me a polite little nod and withdrew. I wondered how on earth it came about that a funny old Englishwoman like that should be the landlady of a hotel in Asia Minor. It was not easy to make her acquaintance, for she knew her place, as she would herself have put it, and she kept me at a distance. It was not for nothing that she had been in service in a noble English family. But I was persistent, and I induced her at last to ask me to have a cup of tea in her own little parlor. I learnt that she had been lady's maid to a certain Lady Ormskirk, and Signor Nicolini, for she never alluded to her deceased husband in any other way, had been his lordship's chef. Signor Nicolini was a very handsome man, and for some years there had been an understanding between them. When they had both saved a certain amount of money, they were married, retired from service, and looked about for a hotel. They had bought this one on an advertisement because Signor Nicolini thought he would like to see something of the world. That was nearly 30 years ago, and Signor Nicolini had been dead for 15. His widow had not once been back to England. I asked her if she was never homesick. "I don't say, as I wouldn't like to go back on a visit, though I expect I'd find many changes. But my family didn't like the idea of me marrying a foreigner, and I haven't spoken to them since. Of course, there are many things here that are not the same as what they have at home, but it's surprising what you get used to. I see a lot of life. I don't know as I should care to live the humdrum life they do in a place like London." I smiled, for what she said was strangely incongruous with her manner. She was a pattern of decorum. It was extraordinary that she could have lived for 30 years in this wild and almost barbaric country without its having touched her. Though I knew no Turkish and she spoke it with ease, I was convinced that she spoke it most incorrectly and with a Cockney accent. I suppose she had remained the precise, prim English lady's maid, knowing her place through all these vicissitudes because she had no faculty of surprise. She took everything that came as a matter of course. She looked upon everyone who wasn't English as a foreigner and therefore as someone, almost imbecile, for whom allowances must be made. She ruled her staff despotically, for did she not know how an upper servant in a great house should exercise his authority over the underservants? And everything about the hotel was clean and neat. "I do my best," she said, when I congratulated her on this, standing, as always, when she spoke to me, with her hands respectfully crossed. "Of course, one can't expect foreigners to have the same ideas what we have, but as his lordship used to say to me, 'What we've got to do, Parker,' he said to me, 'What we've got to do in this life is to make the best of our raw material.'" But she kept her greatest surprise for the eve of my departure. "I'm glad you're not going before you've seen my 2 sons, sir. I didn't know you had any. They've been away on business, but they've just come back. You'll be surprised when you've seen them. I've trained them with me own, and so to speak, and when I'm gone, they'll carry on the hotel between them." In a moment, 2 tall, swarthy, strapping young fellows entered the hall, her eyes lit up with pleasure. They went up to her and took her in their arms and gave her resounding kisses. "They don't speak English, sir, but they understand a little, and of course, they speak Turkish like natives, and Greek and Italian." I shook hands with the pair, and then Signora Nicolini said something to them, and they went away. "They're handsome fellows, Signora," I said. "You must be very proud of them." "I am, sir, and they're good boys, both of them. They've never given me a moment's trouble from the day they was born, and they're the very image of Signor Nicolini. So I must say no one would think they had an English mother." "I'm not exactly their mother, sir. I've just sent them along to say, 'How do you do' to her." I dare say I looked a little confused. "They're the sons that Signor Nicolini had by a Greek girl that used to work in the hotel, and having no children of me own, I adopted them." I sought for some remark to make. "I hope you don't think that there's any blame attaches to Signor Nicolini," she said, drawing herself up a little. "I shouldn't like you to think that, sir." She folded her hands again, and with a mixture of pride, primness, and satisfaction, added the final word. "Signor Nicolini was a very full-blooded man."